You're standing in the Vatican Palace on October 30th, 1501. Around you, 50 of Rome's most powerful men sit at tables laden with gold plates. Cardinals, ambassadors, bankers, ambassadors. The air smells like roasted meat and expensive wine. At the head of the table sits Pope Alexander VI. His daughter Lucrezia is to his left. His son Cesare is to his right. Then the servants clear the tables. That's when you realize this isn't a normal banquet. What happens next isn't legend. It isn't exaggeration. It's documented in multiple independent sources, including a journal kept by the Papal Master of Ceremonies, Johannes Burchard. This is the documented account of what one historian later called the evening that proved the papacy had become a criminal enterprise. Here's what you need to understand first. The year is 1501. Rome is not the Vatican City we know today. The Pope is not just a spiritual leader. He's a temporal prince who controls armies, makes treaties, and plays dynastic politics like any other Italian ruler. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, has been Pope for 9 years. He has multiple acknowledged children. He's used the papacy to make his family the most powerful in Italy. And tonight he's celebrating. Not a religious feast, not a holy day, a wedding, but not his daughter's wedding that happened months ago. Tonight's ceremony is different. Stay with me, because what I'm about to describe comes directly from Johannes Burchard's Liber Notarum, his official diary as Master of Pontifical Ceremonies. The evening begins formally. Dinner, music, standard Renaissance court entertainment. Then, around 10 p.m., the servants bring in something unexpected. Lanterns. Dozens of them. They're arranged around the center of the hall, creating a lit stage area. The guests look confused. This isn't part of normal protocol. Pope Alexander stands and makes an announcement. Burchard records his words. Tonight, we shall witness a demonstration of natural philosophy. Natural philosophy. That's the 15th century term for science, for understanding nature. But that's not what this is. If you believe that the documented records of history's most dangerous figures must be remembered, consider subscribing. Your support helps uncover the moments when power crossed every moral line. Here's what happened next. Servants lead a group of women. Burchard's diary specifies the number. 50 Iris specifies the number. He describes them as honest courtesans, a euphemism for high-class sex workers who served Rome's elite. They're dressed in fine clothes. They're arranged in the lit center space. Then Pope Alexander announces the rules of what he calls the Ballet of the Chestnuts. The name comes from what happens next. Servants scatter chestnuts across the marble floor. Hundreds of them. They roll into corners, under tables, across the lit stage area. The women are told to collect the chestnuts, on their hands and knees, naked. Read that again. The Pope, the Vicar of Christ, the successor to St. Peter, is ordering women to crawl naked across his banquet hall floor, while 50 of the most powerful men in Europe watch. But here's where it crosses from scandal into system. This wasn't random degradation. There was a structure. There were rules. There were prizes. Burchard records the details with bureaucratic precision. The man whose courtesan collected the most chestnuts would receive a prize. But the competition wasn't about the chestnuts. That was just the opening act. Think about the psychology here. By framing cruelty as a game, by adding rules and prizes, you transform participants into competitors. The women aren't victims of assault, they're contestants in a sport. That linguistic trick does powerful psychological work. After the chestnuts are collected, the second phase begins. Burchard describes it clinically. Then the courtesans were required to perform with their patrons before the assembly. The Holy Father watched with pleasure and measured their performances. The Pope wasn't just watching, he was judging. This was a competition. And here's the detail that makes this systematic rather than spontaneous. There were prizes for different categories: most enthusiastic, most creative, most endurance. Burchard records that Pope Alexander personally awarded prizes: tunics of silk, boots, caps, and other gifts. The winners were called forward. The Pope placed the prizes in their hands. He congratulated them. This was ceremonial. Now here's what most people miss about this story. This wasn't a secret orgy that got leaked. This was a public papal event with an official guest list and a Vatican record keeper taking notes. Burchard wasn't writing a scandalous exposé. He was doing his job, recording papal activities for the official archive. Think about that. The master of ceremonies for the Vatican didn't hide this information. He documented it the same way he documented every other papal event: masses, audiences, diplomatic receptions. This was normal enough that it got filed in the official records. That's the terrifying part. Let me show you what happened next in the evening. After the first round of competition, there was a break. Servants brought more wine. The women were given time to rest. Then Pope Alexander announced the third phase. Burchard's diary gets more clinical here, but the meaning is clear. The competitions would continue with escalating requirements. 3 times. That's the number Burchard specifies. Each couple was expected to perform 3 times, publicly, with the Pope and assembled guests continuing to judge and award prizes. Here's the question that should disturb you. What kind of person doesn't leave? You're a cardinal. Maybe you're there for diplomatic reasons. Maybe you didn't know this was going to happen. But now you're 30 minutes into this spectacle. At what point do you stand up and walk out? The historical record suggests nobody did. Not one of the 50 documented guests left the banquet early. They stayed. They watched. Some participated in the competition. Some kept eating dinner. That's not the behavior of people who are shocked. That's the behavior of people who are accustomed. Now let me show you the paper trail. Burchard's diary is the most detailed source, but it's not the only one. Multiple ambassadors sent dispatches home describing the evening. A Venetian envoy, a Florentine observer, a German priest who was visiting Rome. All of them mentioned the event. None of them expressed particular outrages. One ambassador writes, "The Holy Father continues in his customary entertainments." Customary. That word choice tells you this wasn't unique. Here's what happened in the months after. Nothing went by. No scandal erupted. No cardinals resigned. The ambassadors who witnessed the event continued their diplomatic duties. The women who were used in the spectacle returned to their normal lives in Rome. The event was mentioned in private letters and diaries, but never became a public controversy during Alexander VI's lifetime. Why? Because in 1501 Rome, if you were powerful enough, there was no accountability. The Pope controlled the Papal States. He commanded armies. He could excommunicate kings. Who was going to punish him? Think about the mechanics of power that make this possible. You need wealth to host the event. You need authority that prevents retaliation. You need cultural normalization that makes guests comfortable participating. Alexander had all 3. The Borgia family fortune funded the banquet. His papal authority protected him from prosecution. And Renaissance Rome's culture had already normalized buying sexual access to women. All he did was industrialize it, turn it into public entertainment with rules and prizes. That's not spontaneous depravity. That's systematic. Let me show you something that historians debate. In the centuries after, many scholars tried to discredit Burchard's account. They claimed he was exaggerating. They suggested he had political motives for making the Pope look bad. But here's the problem with that defense. Burchard recorded hundreds of papal events over decades. His other entries are confirmed by independent sources. He documented everything from mass schedules to diplomatic ceremonies with reliable accuracy. If he was going to fabricate something, why insert one wildly false event among hundreds of truthful ones? Additionally, the multiple independent accounts from ambassadors corroborate the basic facts. The dates match, the guest list matches, the sequence of events matches. The most likely explanation is the simplest one. It happened. Now here's what makes this more than just a historical scandal. The evening in 1501 wasn't the beginning. It was the peak of a pattern. Burchard's diary records other events, less extreme but similar in structure. Entertainments featuring courtesans, games with sexual elements, public performances judged by the Pope. This was a system, not an anomaly. And systems are built over time. They're refined through repetition. Think about the first time Alexander tried something like this. Maybe it was much smaller. Maybe just a few guests. Maybe less public. But it worked. Nobody stopped him. Nobody objected. So the next time it's a little bigger, a little more explicit. Each iteration pushes the boundary further. That's how normalization works. By October 1501, you can have 50 guests watching 3 rounds of public competition and nobody walks out. Because the progression has been gradual enough that each step felt like a small movement from the previous one. Here's what eventually destroyed the Borgias. Not moral outrages. Not religious reformation. Politics. Alexander VI died in 1503, possibly poisoned. His son, Cesare, who had built a power base through military conquest and strategic assassination, lost his protector. Within months, Cesare's enemies dismantled his territories. He died in Spain a few years later in an obscure battle. The Borgia power collapsed because the political machine broke down, not because anyone cared about the October 1501 banquet. In fact, look at what happened to the evidence. Burchard's diary wasn't published until 1883. Nearly 400 years after the events. It sat in Vatican archives, technically accessible but practically buried. When it was finally published, the Vatican didn't deny the contents. They just didn't talk about it. The strategy wasn't suppression. It was neglect. Don't burn the document that draws attention. Just don't mention it. Don't include it in official histories. Let it gather dusteries. That's how institutions erase inconvenient truths, not through dramatic destruction, but through quiet omission. Now here's what haunts me about this story. Those 50 women who were used in the spectacle, we don't have their names. Burchard calls them honest courtesans, but he doesn't identify them individually. None of the ambassador accounts name them. No personal letters survive from their perspective. They were present at one of the most documented events in Renaissance history, and they remain anonymous. That's not accidental. The historical record obsessively documents the powerful. We know what Pope Alexander ate for breakfast. We know which cardinals sat where. We know the gifts that were awarded. But the women who were the actual subjects of the event? Erased. That's what power does. It writes the history where it's the subject and everyone else's scenery. Here's the question nobody wants to confront. How many people knew about this? Not just the 50 guests at the banquet, but the servants who set up the chairs, the cooks who prepared the food, the guards who stood at the doors. The Vatican wasn't a small operation. Hundreds of people worked there. This event required coordination, planning, supplies. All those people went to work the next day and just continued. No revolt, no resignation, no moral crisis. Because at the end of the day, they needed their jobs more than they needed their consciences. That's the machinery of systematic evil. Not that bad things happen, but that ordinary people facilitate them and then move on. Let me show you why this story matters beyond just Renaissance scandal. The Ballet of the Chestnuts represents a documented moment when institutional power created a system for public degradation, and nobody with the ability to stop it chose to do so. That's not unique to 1501. That's a pattern. Every time an institution becomes powerful enough to escape accountability, and every time the people around it decide their careers matter more than their ethics, you create the conditions for this kind of event. The Vatican in 1501. Corporate boardrooms today, government offices, universities, Any institution with enough power and enough insularity. The specifics change, the mechanism doesn't. If this moment in history doesn't make you think about power and accountability today, you're missing the lesson. In 2010, there was a proposal to create a Vatican museum exhibit about difficult moments in papal history. The Ballet of the Chestnuts was on the list of potential inclusions. The proposal was rejected. The official reason given was concerns about appropriate interpretation. Translation: we don't want to talk about this. So Burchard's diary remains an academic footnote, mentioned in specialized Renaissance histories, occasionally cited in books about the Borgias, but not part of the standard narrative of papal history, not taught in schools, not included in Vatican tours. The erasure continues. Here's what we're left with at. On October 30th, 1501, the man who claimed spiritual authority over all of Christendom turned human beings into entertainment. He created rules, awarded prizes, and judged performances. He did this publicly, with witnesses, and documented it in official records. And for 500 years, the institution he led has responded with silence, not denial, not apology. Silence. That might be the most honest thing the Vatican has ever said about this event, because what defense is there? You can't claim it didn't happen. The documentation is too solid. You can't claim it was justified. There's no moral framework that allows it. You can't claim it was an exception. The pattern suggests otherwise. All you can do is stay quiet and hope people don't ask too many questions. But here's the thing about history. The questions don't go away just because institutions ignore them. Those 50 women whose names we don't know they existed. They experienced that evening. They lived with whatever came after. And they deserve to be remembered as more than anonymous scenery in someone else's scandal. That's why we tell these stories. Not to judge the past by modern standards, that's too easy, but to recognize that the machinery of power and degradation doesn't disappear. It evolves, it adapts, it finds new forms. And the only defense against it is people who are willing to remember, to document, and to refuse the comfortable erasure that institutions prefer. Burchard did that. Whatever his motives, whatever his limitations, he wrote it down. Those scratch marks on Vatican marble, evidence of someone's presence, someone's resistance. They're still there if you know where to look. If this exposed something you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep uncovering the history that institutions tried to erase. Drop a comment with your thoughts on how we hold power accountable, and I'll see you in the next investigation.